how do we hold that tension as God is clearly making new waves in the land in these days? At least that's what I'm noticing. And it's exciting and it's invigorating. And there are things we have to put up behind that to support it, to steward it, to care for it. How do we find that balance? How do we maintain the movement essence with the need for some level of structuring?
Very complicated story, Joe. There are there are competing values at work there. And anytime you've got competing values, you have just moved into the realm of adaptive change, as Heifetz and others would suggest. And adaptive change is very complicated
Mhm.
because you are really holding these tensions. And institutional survival becomes a real value. How do we perpetuate this institution so it keeps going? Clashing that with a organic grassroots movement that's trying to renew it could threaten the survival or could augment and really stimulate the survival. And
Mm.
so those become the concerns, and the degree of loyalty becomes a question. Are you really loyal to the big institution, or are you loyal to this little movement that, if it doesn't get its way, is just going to depart? So those become critical issues. I've lived through all of those with big denominations, and there is just, it takes an enormous amount of conversation and an enormous amount of fleshing out of perspectives, values, loyalties, perceptions, because it's really easy to throw stones at this old dying institution, and we have all the answers. And if you would just let us take over, and so it can look like a revolution going on where we're trying to throw out the old guys and take over, and that's threatening to every
But
institution.
you're also talking here, I think what you're alluding to here is something else that I talk a lot about with different groups, is that there's a character issue going on between the institutional leader and the movement leader. And so there's a little bit of this lack of honor that you see going back and forth between each
Totally,
other. And
totally.
I'm wondering what it looks like to begin to cultivate a different kind of conversation where there's an understanding from both sides, a movement leader and institutional leader, and an appreciation, and how can we actually walk towards one another? Because I think at the heart, and that's what I was picking up yesterday in this conversation with this gentleman, was at the heart, we want the same things for our communities, but we're starting from different starting points. And how can we actually walk hand in hand? I know Ralph Winter talks a lot about the sodality and the modality, finding that synergy together, because that's really what will sustain the movements of God long term on land with people, because people need structures, they need stability, they
Right.
need that stuff. But how can we begin to move forward in the absence of an honoring culture? And I think that a lot of the ways in which they were asking questions in the early 1800s, early 1900s might help us get there. I mean, what would you say to the church today? I mean, how would you encourage some of our younger leaders today? Is like, there's the movement leaders and the denominational leaders. How would you encourage us to rethink, one, how we're relating to each other, but then two, how we're measuring what we're doing on either side?
Age-old problem, Joe. And do remember that in that first Great Awakening, it created splits. You
Mhm.
know, what we had, the old lights and the new lights. The
Okay.
old lights saw things the way it had been and were loyal to the institution. The new lights were saying, no, you guys have missed the point. You don't understand experiential religion. You've got to embrace it. And so there was arrogance, there was tenacious hold on power,
Mm.
battling each other. The Second Great Awakening created the same kind of splits, and we called it the new school and the old school then, but it was the same issue that, in effect, was pushing people apart. So you would think by now we've seen this dynamic enough that we should be able to rehearse it and say, is there an alternative narrative?
Yeah.
But it really so much depends, Joe, on each person's discipleship
Yes.
and each person's self-awareness, growth in humility, willingness to listen, discovery of honoring other ways of doing things, but we tend instead to cast blame,
Hmm.
put shame on people and
Hmm.
say, you're just an old fuddy-duddy. You don't want a movement of the spirit. You're just guarding yourself and trying to keep your little position. And other people say, well, you're just a radical that has no appreciation of tradition and history and elders. And so for both groups, there is a deep challenge in a growing, what Jim Collins would call level 5 leader, who is committed to the vision and doesn't care who gets credit and is just
Yeah.
humble. And I'm just sad to say that our developmental process and our sanctification in pretty much all eras of the church has just allowed stunted growth. By now, you ought to be on solid food and you've got to go back to
Yeah.
milk.
Yeah.
And I am guilty. I've had those same feelings in my young days trying to fix a dying denomination. And I'm not sure my humility was ever as strong as I thought it was.
That seems to
Because
be a
my
theme. Yeah.
self-awareness just takes a long time to grow. I've got a bald spot on the top of my head, Joe.
Yeah,
We
me
can't
too.
see it here. You can still see hair. But if we had the camera in back, it would be there. And see, that's bald spot is in my soul too. And I
Mm.
just can't always see it. Other people can. And if I listen to other people, then I might be able to realize it really is there. But day to day, I don't think it's there.